You're not welcome here, Daniel. This is my day, and I don't want you ruining it. My sister's voice cracked across the churchyard like a whip, every head turning toward me as though I were some uninvited stranger crashing a sacred moment. And the laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough. Those muffled chuckles of bridesmaids and cousins and family friends who had no clue how much of this entire wedding had been built on my back. How many years I'd spent quietly paying off her debts, covering her tuition, even wiring money when she cried over maxed out credit cards. Yet in that moment all they saw was her dramatic hand gesture telling me to leave as though I were some parasite feeding off her generosity instead of the other way around, and I felt the sting not just of rejection but of deep humiliation, because to be cast out in front of all these people, some of whom I'd known since childhood, was like being stripped bare in the middle of town square, my worth measured against the bitterness in her voice. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of Midwest town where people remember what car you drove 10 years ago and where your mother bought her groceries, a place where reputation lingers like the smell of fried food from the corner diner. And I mention that because what happened with my sister didn't happen in some anonymous city where humiliation fades into the crowd. It happened in a community where everyone talks, where every sideways glance carries a story, where a man can build a life of success, move up and out, but still get dragged back down by family who see him not as who he became, but who he was when he was too young to defend himself. I'm not going to spell out everything just yet, but let's just say I had one card up my sleeve, one advantage they never accounted for, and while they were busy thinking they were breaking me, I was already calculating how to use that overlooked detail to break them instead. The thing about my sister, Rachel, is she was always the golden one in the eyes of my parents. Not because she worked harder or achieved more, but because she could cry prettier tears, tell more dramatic stories, and twist guilt like a knife until people bent to her will. Growing up, she'd fail a test, and somehow it became my fault because I didn't help her study. She'd crash a car, and it became my fault for not warning her about icy roads. And as the years went by, I learned to absorb the blame, to keep the peace. And when I started making money, real money from the business I built after college, a logistics company that went from one rented truck to a fleet of 30 running across the state, I did what I thought a good brother should do. I stepped in whenever she faltered. I wrote checks without questions. I booked flights for her so-called career opportunities. I covered medical bills she forgot to pay. I even let her live in my condo rent-free for a year while she got back on her feet. At the time, I convinced myself it was loyalty, it was family, it was what my late father would have wanted, but deep down I think I knew I was feeding a wolf that would never be satisfied, and the wolf grew hungrier each time it was indulged. And my mother and stepfather, they enabled it. Not maliciously maybe, but with that blind favoritism that mothers sometimes carry for daughters, especially dramatic ones. And every holiday dinner it was the same script, Rachel spinning some story about her struggles, my mother sighing, my stepfather patting her hand, and then all eyes sliding to me as though the solution was already obvious, as though my success existed only to be siphoned into her endless black hole of need. So when the wedding came around, I didn't just assume I'd be invited, I assumed I'd be standing near the front, maybe even giving a toast, because hadn't I funded half of it? I'd wired money directly to the caterer when Rachel cried about deposits. I'd put down the deposit for the venue itself when she claimed her this family was short on funds, and I'd even covered her dress fitting with my card after she made a scene at the boutique about how unfair it was that she couldn't look like a princess on her big day. And yet there I was, standing in front of that church, told in front of everyone that I wasn't wanted, not just privately disinvited, but publicly shamed, stripped of dignity by the very person I thought I'd been saving all these years. The guests looked at me with that mix of pity and smugness, the way people look when they're glad it isn't them. And my sister turned back toward her fiancé with that triumphant little smirk, as if she'd finally proven that she could cut me out, and the world would still applaud her. In that moment, something in me shifted, not with the kind of explosive rage you might expect, but with a coldness I hadn't known I was capable of. A steady pulse of resolve that whispered to me that if this was how they wanted the story written, I'd finish it in ink they'd never be able to wash off. On the drive away from that church, I kept replaying the humiliation in my mind, the sting of her words, the scattered laughter of cousins I once babysat, the silence of my mother who didn't defend me, who didn't even look at me, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I realized this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about a lifetime of being the safety net no one ever thanked, the scapegoat no one ever defended, the brother who gave everything and was treated like nothing. That's when the symbol came back to me. Something small, almost laughably small, but etched into my memory, the key. Not just any key, but the old brass house key I'd given Rachel years ago when I let her live in my condo. The one she returned in an envelope scrawled with, "Thanks, you're the best," in her dramatic handwriting. I'd kept it on my desk since then. Not out of sentiment, but as a quiet reminder of boundaries, of how trust could be lent but must eventually be returned. That key was nothing more than metal, but in that moment, I realized it was more than that. It was proof of access, proof of history, proof of who opened doors and who closed them. And though Rachel didn't know it yet, that key was going to come back. And when it did, it wouldn't just be a symbol of her entitlement. It would be the instrument of her undoing. When I pulled into my driveway that night, the silence of the house hit me harder than the humiliation itself. Because this was the home I built brick by brick with years of 18-hour days, where every piece of furniture had been chosen with the thought of sharing it with people I loved. And yet the walls echoed with emptiness, as though even the house itself knew I had been exiled from the very family I'd supported. And as I sank onto the couch, the phone lit up with messages that told me exactly how deep the betrayal went. First from my mother. "Daniel, you should have respected your sister's wishes." This was her moment. Then from cousins who wrote smug little notes like, "Maybe it's time you stop trying to control everything with your money," as if my money hadn't put food on their table at Christmas or covered emergency bills no one else would touch. And the coolest message came from my stepfather, a short, almost businesslike line that read, "It's better this way. You've had your time, now let Rachel shine." That word, shine, stuck in my throat like a shard of glass because it implied I'd been some spotlight-hogging figure desperate for attention when all I'd ever done was work in silence and provide quietly. And I realized then that the narrative had been flipped against me so skillfully, so insidiously that they had convinced themselves I was the selfish one. I spent hours that night pacing, replaying their words, battling the storm inside my head, and though part of me wanted to scream, to drive back to that church and call out their hypocrisy in front of every smug face in attendance, a deeper part of me whispered restraint, whispered patience, whispered that the best revenge was never in loud declarations, but in subtle movements that left the guilty choking on their own smugness. And I remembered the key again, that brass reminder on my desk, and my mind began stitching together threads of possibility that, at the time, even I didn't fully see the shape of. The days that followed were a blur of whispers and tightening control. My sister posting filtered photos from her honeymoon in CABO, while family members commented heart emojis, tagging me with little passive-aggressive remarks about how relaxing must look nice if you don't have to work all the time. Ignoring the fact that the only reason Rachel could afford that trip was because she'd leaned on me for deposits and expenses that drained thousands from my account. Yet now in their eyes, she was the hard-working bride who deserved her happiness, while I was the bitter brother sulking in silence. And my mother, God, she played her part well, calling me with that soft but firm disappointment that only mothers can wield, saying things like, "You've always been too serious, Daniel, maybe this is a chance to lighten up," or, "Don't begrudge your sister her moment, she's been through a lot." As if I hadn't been through more. As if decades of carrying the financial and emotional weight for everyone else counted for nothing. And I bit my tongue because fighting back then would have meant playing into their narrative, proving them right in their eyes, and I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I began to act broken, to let them believe their cruelty had worked, skipping family dinners when invited, answering calls with monotone disinterest, letting word circulate through the grapevine that Daniel was finally humbled, finally quiet. And I knew that image of me crumbling fed their egos, made them feel they had put me in my place. But beneath the stillness, I was planning. It started small, subtle. The way I shifted things in my business. The way I made myself scarce in conversations that used to revolve around me. The way I withdrew support without ever announcing it. Rachel expected me to cover her rent when she returned from her honeymoon to find the bills stacked high, but instead she was met with cold letters from landlords and creditors who no longer received quiet checks in the mail. My mother expected me to fund her annual trip to Florida like I did every spring, but I politely declined with a flat, "Can't swing it this year." And the silence on the other end of the line was almost delicious, because for the first time in years, they were forced to feel the absence of my generosity. Yet even then, They tightened their grip in subtler ways, spreading rumors about me to family friends, that I'd grown arrogant, that success had made me bitter, that I was unstable and not the same Daniel we knew. And when word of that reached me through old friends in Dayton, it stung because reputation in a town like ours isn't something you shake easily. But rather than defend myself, I let the whispers circulate, knowing that each rumor, each exaggeration, was digging them deeper into a pit they didn't even realize they were in. The one small win I had, the flicker of light in those weeks, came from my godfather, an older man named Henry who'd always seen through Rachel's dramatics, and who called me after hearing about the wedding, his gravelly voice cutting through the fog of shame. "You don't deserve this, Danny," he said. "I watched you build everything with your own hands, and I watched them bleed you dry. Let them laugh now." People like that always choke on their own lies. His words steadied me, reminded me that not everyone was blind, and that faint validation gave me strength I didn't even know I needed. But just as quickly as that light appeared, it was snuffed out when Rachel herself called me a week later, her voice smug and syrupy sweet, asking if I could spot her just a little more cash because wedding expenses had piled up unexpectedly. And when I calmly said no, she unleashed a tirade so venomous it almost knocked the phone from my hand, accusing me of being jealous, of wanting to see her fail, of being bitter that, for once the family is looking at me instead of you. And in that one outburst, her true motive bled through, the jealousy that had been simmering for years, the resentment that I had built something on my own while she floundered, the deep hatred not just of my success but of the fact that despite all her dramatics, she had never once been the center of admiration in the way she craved. I hung up that call trembling, not with fear but with certainty. The certainty that my revenge wouldn't just be about money, it would be about forcing her to confront that emptiness inside her, to strip away the illusions she built, and to do it so cleanly that she wouldn't even realize it was me until the walls had already collapsed. So I played the role of the broken brother perfectly, letting her and the others think they had won, while in reality I was moving pieces across the board they couldn't even see. Every day that passed was another step closer to the moment I knew was coming, because Rachel had one flaw, one fatal habit she couldn't escape. She always overreached. Give her an inch, she'd demand a mile. Hand her a check, she'd expect a blank one next time. And just as I'd suspected, she started talking about wanting to buy a house now that she was married, dropping hints to my mother who, in turn, dropped them to me in her practiced guilt-tripping tone. And when I didn't respond, Rachel escalated, showing up at my office one afternoon in a whirlwind of perfume and entitlement, tossing her hair and saying, "You could help us with a down payment. It's not like you can't afford it." I smiled politely, feigned regret, told her things were tight right now, and the flicker of anger in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't satisfied with humiliating me at the wedding. She wanted to strip me of resources too, to make me kneel financially the way she had made me kneel publicly. And that was when I knew the noose was tightening, not around me, but around her, and she was happily placing her own head inside it. I spent the next few weeks in what I let them all believe was retreat and defeat, but in reality, every day was a calculated maneuver. Every coffee in the diner, every drive down I-75 past the familiar exits of Dayton, every seemingly idle phone call was a thread being woven into a trap so precise it would leave Rachel and the family blind to the moment of their undoing until it hit. And it began with the house she demanded. The one she and her new husband had been hinting about, a sprawling property just outside town with oak floors and a yard that screamed prosperity. And the family thought I would bend, thought that the humiliation of the wedding plus my resentment would be enough to make me write the check. And I smiled privately when my real plan clicked into place because they didn't see the subtle leverage I had. The brass key, the symbol I'd kept tucked away on my desk, wasn't just sentimental anymore. It was access, and access meant control. And control meant that the family's blind indulgence of Rachel's entitlement would become their undoing. And as the days ticked by, I planted small, almost invisible clues that looking back would have tipped anyone perceptive to the truth. But they were not perceptive. They were arrogant, convinced of their moral high ground, and that arrogance made them sloppy, and I watched it all unfold like a silent observer in my own narrative. I met with realtors, appraisers, and banks under my own name, but discreetly, never showing that I was laying groundwork for an emergency purchase plan, one that would give me legal leverage over Rachel without her ever suspecting it. And in between, I let her flaunt her happiness on social media, her friends commenting how generous her brother must have been, how lucky she was. And each post added fuel to the fire in my mind, because the illusion of her dominance was exactly what I needed to keep her unguarded, to keep the family thinking I was beaten. Meanwhile, her husband, the poor sap blinded by love and ambition, treated me with condescending politeness, as if I were some sad figure from his bride's past, and I played it perfectly, nodding, smiling, even offering small advice about neighborhood schools, while secretly calculating exactly when and how to use the contracts, the letters, the escrow accounts to turn his perception against her, and by extension, against my mother and stepfather, who had become complicit in every subtle act of humiliation. The ticking clock came in the form of a legal deadline for the down payment on the house, a date Rachel had publicly announced at a brunch with all the family, boasting about how she'd secured everything thanks to me, and the irony made me almost laugh out loud because they believed their timeline would pressure me into compliance. Yet what they didn't realize was that the plan had already been set in motion weeks before, that escrow accounts were in my name, but designed to collapse if she touched them improperly, and that every push, every demand they made only tightened the noose around their own heads. I even let my sister believe she had outmaneuvered me once, sending her a mock, reluctant wire transfer, which in reality routed through an intermediary that I controlled, a minor detail perhaps, invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but a critical puzzle piece that would ensure that when the trap sprung, the funds she assumed she could touch legally would vanish in a heartbeat, leaving her scrambling in front of her friends, her husband, and the entire family who had lined up to watch her reign as the golden daughter. And I had rehearsed the reactions I wanted: confusion, denial, accusations, the way she would look at her own mother and father in disbelief, realizing that the indulgence that had elevated her was also the indulgence that had left her naked, powerless, and exposed to a reality she had never considered. But I didn't stop there. The subtle mini-reveal I planted in private emails, small discrepancies in bills, hints at financial oversights, a misplaced document or two, all appeared accidental, almost laughable. Yet every piece nudged the family to overreach, to double down on their assumptions, and by the time the house closing date arrived, they were fully convinced that victory was theirs, that Daniel was the humbled brother, the one broken by his own loyalty and generosity, when the truth was that the trap had been quietly set, and all I needed was the final move. Even my friends, those I trusted with tiny pieces of information, were in on only part of the plan, so that leaks and misinformation would feed the family's false confidence, and by now Rachel had begun to treat me as a ghost, a figure who existed only in her narrative of past support, someone too wounded to act, someone too weak to resist, and that underestimation, that arrogance, was everything. The symbolic key rested on my desk, gleaming under the late afternoon light, almost as if it knew it was the final actor in this silent play, and I would carry it with me when the moment came, when the final documents were signed, when the smug faces around me would realize they had been outmaneuvered not with confrontation or screaming, but with patience, precision, and foresight. There were other subtleties, the kind that audiences in viral storytelling respond to, but participants in the drama overlook, like the way Rachel's husband tried to assert dominance over small details. Which bank, which realtor, which closing attorney, each decision guided by me without their knowledge, each choice funneling them toward the inevitable collapse, and the family, drunk on their self-righteousness, never suspected that the very hand they reached for to hold control was the one orchestrating the downfall. My mother, who called me once to apologize, pleading for reconciliation, only reinforced my strategy, because she too had become part of the mechanism that would topple them, her guilt blinding her to the truth, making her offer little concessions that would later be revealed as irreversible mistakes once I executed the final phase. Even Henry, my godfather, noticed the pattern forming and remarked once with a gravelly chuckle over coffee, "They don't even know they're digging their own grave, Danny." And I smiled quietly, knowing he understood what I could not yet reveal publicly. And there were moments of pure emotional whiplash, watching Rachel post photos of herself in the new house she thought she controlled, each snapshot a silent taunt to me, yet in reality a showcase of her own hubris, because each action she took without my knowledge, each assumption of ownership, only reinforced the legal and financial cage I had designed around her, invisible, intricate, and utterly inescapable. By the time the week of the closing arrived, the family was oblivious to the pattern I had created. Every document checked, Every wire transfer seemingly approved. Every signature obtained under the guise of compliance was a step closer to unveiling the final humiliation. The revelation that all of Rachel's assumed power and wealth was built on nothing more than the very foundation I controlled. And the tension inside me was sharp, electric, a mix of anticipation and the satisfaction that comes from knowing justice will be served with subtlety, cruelty, and inevitability. I let them think they had won, let them bask in the glow of what they believed was their triumph, while I orchestrated the final plays from the shadows, using the very tools they had manipulated me into ignoring patience, foresight, and the unassuming brass key. And in that quiet, methodical tightening, I realized that this wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming dignity, proving that loyalty should not be mistaken for weakness, and ensuring that the family who had betrayed me felt the full impact of their arrogance, their cruelty, and their blindness. Back then, I didn't realize the one detail they overlooked would be their undoing, the silent instrument of poetic justice resting on my desk, gleaming and waiting. And by the time the sun set on that day, the stage was set, the trap fully loaded, and all that remained was the moment of truth, the final act where the hidden plan, the overlooked advantage, and the symbolic key would converge to deliver a reckoning no one saw coming. The day the closing was supposed to happen, I arrived at the office early, the brass key in my hand glinting under the fluorescent lights, a quiet talisman of everything I'd built and everything I was about to reclaim. And when Rachel walked in with her husband trailing behind, dressed to impress and brimming with that smug confidence that had become her armor, I let her think she had already won. Smiling politely, nodding, asking her about the weather and the local schools, while inside I was counting seconds, heart steady, mind razor sharp, because the trap was no longer theory, it was a living, breathing web, and they were about to walk right into it. As the escrow officer started reviewing the documents, Rachel leaned over the table, whispering, "You know, Daniel, I never thought you'd actually let this happen. I expected a fight." And I simply smiled, letting the silence hang, letting her hubris do the work for me, because she had already assumed the narrative that I was the bitter, resentful brother who couldn't let go. And in that assumption, she had exposed herself completely, signing forms, initialing papers, and authorizing transfers she believed were hers, unaware that each action funneled through my intermediary accounts, controlled by the legal structures I'd quietly established over the past month. And by the time the escrow officer handed her the final keys to the property, the digital trail of funds had already been rerouted, frozen by contingencies only I had set, leaving her staring at a stack of legal confirmations that showed she technically owned nothing, her husband's face dropping in disbelief as he realized the wires had bounced, the approvals voided, and that this was no accident, no clerical error, this was precise, intentional, and inescapable. And then came the key, the symbol that had seemed so innocuous for years. I took it from my pocket and placed it on the table between us. A simple brass relic from the condo I'd once allowed her to live in. And the way her eyes widened as she recognized it told me everything, because it was the tangible representation of her entitlement, her assumption that I had no leverage, the proof that she had walked into a trap of her own making. I watched her face drain of color, watched her mouth open and close like a fish, fumbling for words, realizing that all the money, all the gifts, all the assumed power she had wielded over me and the family was meaningless, that the one person she thought powerless had been quietly orchestrating her downfall, and the look she gave me, that mixture of horror, shame, and disbelief, was far more satisfying than any monetary gain, because it was the raw, unfiltered realization that she had been outmaneuvered not by force or aggression, but by patience, intelligence, and a subtle understanding of human greed and overconfidence. My mother tried to interject, her voice trembling as she said, "Daniel, maybe this is just a mistake. But even she could see it wasn't a mistake, couldn't undo the network of legal and financial maneuvers I had set in motion, and my stepfather, pale and rigid, simply looked at me, a mixture of regret and shock, understanding finally that their favoritism and indulgence had built this structure for me to collapse. But instead, they were the ones falling into the trap, and Rachel's husband tried to yell to claim some error in process, some technicality, but I had anticipated every potential move, every protest, every tiny loophole he might try to exploit, and it all led back to the same truth. Daniel Mercer was not the defeated brother. Daniel Mercer was the architect of their humiliation. Then came the double twist. Because while Rachel was focused on the immediate loss of the house, the diverted funds, and the exposure of her arrogance, I revealed the second hidden layer. The intermediary accounts I had used were not only legally binding but structured so that any attempt to reclaim the funds would trigger a chain reaction, seizing assets they didn't even realize were at risk. Including the stock my parents had inherited, the trust Rachel thought was untouchable, and the family vehicles they had always considered mine to leverage in petty disputes. And as I outlined the chain, showing her mother and stepfather the web of financial instruments, escrow contingencies, and binding contracts, the look of disbelief turned to panic, then despair, and I could see in their eyes that the realization was complete. Their own greed, their own favoritism, and their own blind confidence had become their undoing, and nothing could save them from the consequences they had earned through years of entitlement and cruelty. And yet, as dramatic as all that was, the poetic justice came quietly, personally. I handed Rachel back the brass key, now a symbol of lessons learned the hard way, and said softly, "You wanted to walk into my world thinking you were untouchable." This key, it always reminded me of boundaries, respect, and who holds the doors. Consider this your reminder. Her shoulders slumped, tears brimming, pride shattered, and the key glinted in the sunlight streaming through the office window, like a beacon of all the times I had been taken for granted, all the times I had been cast aside, and now it was a quiet hammer striking home. The betrayal had been acknowledged, repaid, and the moral balance restored. I left the office that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in years, the tension in my chest dissolving with every step toward the car, because the revenge had not been loud, not been explosive, but complete. The family had been forced to see the consequences of their actions, and I had reclaimed not just resources, but dignity, autonomy, and the understanding that loyalty should never be mistaken for weakness. Driving away, I passed the old diner where Rachel had once gushed about wedding plans, where my parents had eaten quietly while I picked up the tab for decades of indulgence, and I realized the subtle satisfaction of watching them choke on the very assumptions they had built, that money, love, and generosity could be exploited without consequence, was richer than any bank balance. And the final double twist lingered. Rachel's husband, who thought he could impress her with bravado and dominance, was now just another witness to her fallibility, seeing the truth of her character in the stark, humbling reality I had orchestrated. And my mother and stepfather, who had tried to manage the optics of family and loyalty, were left stunned by the consequences of favoritism unchecked, forced to reckon with the fact that their blindness had paved the way for their own embarrassment, financial loss, and shame. I smiled quietly, the sun setting behind the city skyline, and felt that rarest of satisfactions. The emotional freedom that comes not from rage, not from spectacle, but from knowing that justice, subtle, precise, and elegant, had been delivered. They had fallen into the trap they set, blinded by greed and pride, and I had emerged unscathed, whole, and profoundly liberated. The brass key now a quiet emblem of every lesson, every betrayal, and every hard-earned victory. A reminder that sometimes the best revenge is patience, precision, and letting those who betrayed you become the architects of their own downfall. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.